Now, historically speaking, there are some classes which are frighteningly close, it seems, in conception, and some classes which are obviously separate, but actually are still frighteningly close in conception. And there are some classes which it's very easy to start a debate over. And today, I have a doozy of a pair for you to consider. I have the Invincible and Kiev classes, and they fit together because they are both contenders for the title of a through-deck cruiser. Now, I would say the Soviet vessels, the Kiev class, are of course, in strictest terms, for treaty reasons, to allow them to pass through certain straits, heavy aviation cruisers, or aircraft carrying cruisers, depending on who you're talking to and which translation you're reading in which book. Yes, there are historians who like to have a disagreement about that, and I'm not going to get into that one today. On the Invincible class, there is something special. So, you will find many historians who will tell you that there are no official documents which refer to them as through-deck cruisers. None at all. And I've looked, and I cannot really disagree with them, although there are memoirs. But I have something different up my sleeve, which I cannot prove in academic sense, so I cannot put in a textbook. I can't put it in any book. I can't write it down. But I can explain it on the video, and you can pass your own judgment on this. But the difference I have is my dad. Now, my dad was a naval architect for many years, and he's no longer with us. He worked on many projects, and his friends worked on many other projects. In fact, there wasn't a ship painted grey for the Royal Navy for pretty much 1950, possibly 1948, 1950 definitely, onwards, that he wasn't involved with in some sense. In fact, some of the last ships he was involved with have yet to enter service that he was involved with the design of before he died. Consulting generally over a couple of drinks in a pub sort of way, and sometimes actually paid consultancy work over them. That's the fun thing of having a father who, amongst many things, actually was the guy who probably did a huge amount for developing computer-aided design in as it applies to ships and ship design. He literally wrote some of the original programs. Anyway, because of that background, because of what my dad was involved in, I had a lot of conversations over the years with a lot of naval architects, and the through-deck cruiser thing came up. Because that was kind of interesting to me, especially when I was doing my bachelor's, which was about the Falklands War, and I was doing a dissertation. I was talking with Michael Clarke and Julian Thompson, and I was writing about all the carrier groups and the amphibious task group down there in the command structure, and trying to figure out how they fitted in, and was talking about that with my dad and his friends when I met them in a pub at one point. And this was when we'd, after 10 years apart, started making friends again between the families. So this was actually not during my bachelor's, it was during my master's, I think. Maybe even beginning of my PhD. But anyway, it's always fuzzy now that that's over a decade ago as well. But the story that was told to me was quite simple. When the naval constructors, especially older naval constructors in the room, were listening to the description being given of the Invincible class, and what they were wanting them to do, they decided they were through-deck cruisers, because what the Royal Navy was asking for was more traditionally associated with the cruiser role, especially the flagship cruiser, the station cruiser, the status cruiser role, than the aircraft carrier role. So they took as their design motif through-deck cruiser. Rather than necessarily thinking aircraft carrier, or aviation ship, or aviation auxiliary, or some of the other things which wander around the Invincible class, they were thinking through-deck cruiser, and that guided their approach to their design, construction, and shaping, and some of the decisions they make about their staterooms, and their organisation, their command and control, and the priority given to certain systems in their layout, come from that. So that's my little bit of a piece of information for you all. But as said, I was not running a recorder at the time. I did not take down everyone's name and level of involvement in the project, in the discussion. They were just my dad's old friends, and I had been his chauffeur. I'd taken him to the meal because he didn't feel like driving that day. In simple terms, he was an older gentleman, and he was planning on, in moderation, having a single drink that day, so he didn't want to drive as well. I think it was also partially him trying to regain trust of the family because it had been his drinking which had caused some of the trouble beforehand. But we'll leave that to one side. He was a very good naval architect. He was not very good outside of work sometimes. So, with that in mind, these two classes are, I think, quite rightly, contenders for through-deck cruisers. Invincible and Kiev. Now, the Invincibles actually come after the Kievs. That's often an interesting point that comes about. People sometimes forget that one. The Kievs are not inspired by the Invincibles. The Royal Navy doesn't make the leap first. No, the Kiev's been in service for 5 years and been under discussion for a lot longer by the time Invincible is coming about. Is launched. This is the reality. And the reality is also that they are different. One is very much a Soviet-focused design for the Soviet strategic situation, and one is very much a British-focused design for the British strategic situation. They are different. You could argue that perhaps a vessel of more similar design to this might have been more suitable for some of the operations, with appropriate changes in technology, of course, to reflect those different origins. For some of the operations this vessel ends up in, but both are products of the design trees and the strategic and geostrategic situations and decisions made by their governments and their navies. They have different style, but they have some similarities. Both are conceived in a way to be flagships. There was actually discussion during the Invincibles. At one point, there was an idea of possibly making them completely unarmed. Just aviation. No weapons at all. But apparently a very senior admiral at the time, and there is a debate as to which admiral it was, but there are enough admirals who've tried to claim credit that I'm fairly sure at least one of them did, made the remark that they weren't going on a flagship which was unarmed. That is been an honest discussion about aircraft carriers for a long time. There was honestly some people who put forward the idea that maybe if you didn't put defensive weapons on aircraft carriers in the 1920s, then no one would attack them because there was no point in attacking them. It was only worthwhile attacking their aircraft. Thankfully, that particular bright spark was shot down hard, but it comes up time and time again, mainly for two reasons. One, if you're using weapons from an aircraft carrier, you will always get fragments ending up on your deck somehow. It doesn't matter, it's just a law of, I don't know, comedic returns. There will always be some fragments end up on your flight deck, and you will need to remove them. Second, and this is more of a worry in many ways than the FOD walk, to get rid of it, is the fact that when you're firing those weapons, you're going to inevitably make portions of your flight deck unusable. Now, that can be a relatively small portion of your flight deck, depending on where it's firing, for a close-in weapon system, or could be a relatively large portion of your flight deck when you're launching a rather large missile. By the way, this missile can be a basalt, it can be a sea dart, both of which have rather large pyrotechnical effects, should I say, taking place behind them when they launch. It's not a fun experience to be standing there, and it's not good for your aircraft. So, there is a factor. There is a factor. Now, we're roughly 10 minutes and 20 seconds in, so it's Shameless book plug time. I did skip this recently on a video, to an extent, till the end. I'm not going to make a habit of that, and there is a reason I don't make a habit of that. One, I'm always trying to push for book sales because, as I've said before, I'm a British academic. Our entire career path, as far as universities are concerned, is largely attributed to our book sales. But more importantly, I've just moved house. I'm buying a lot of calyxes for my books, and all sorts of other things to set this house up. I'm pushing for book sales here, and a nice big Christmas book sale really would be helpful. It's shameless book plug. It's completely shameless. No, more importantly, it's a case of I want to do a lot of do some research. I want to get. There are some books which are going through and are going to be coming out hopefully soon, and they've been ready for a while, and I've been sort of not doing them because I hadn't got the money to put the pictures in them, and I'm slowly getting the money for the pictures and sorting that out as well as moving. But they've now been sitting for long enough. I would like to go and do a little bit of extra research because some bits have been niggling me. So, yeah. Any funding coming in, literally at the moment it's going on calyxes or calyxes for the bookshelves. And once I've got the bookshelves, then anything after that is going on research. Because that's why I do the YouTube videos, to pay for my research. I find it far more sensible than applying for grant funding because, in many ways, this is far more open. This is far more visible for funding. Grants have their place, and I will probably be applying for them in the future. But that's for when you need big chunks for big things, in my experience. For ongoing research projects, when you need little bits constantly coming in and constantly going out, I think, honestly, doing something like this, Patreon, Ko-fi, those things, is a far more sensible way to go if people are going to support your research. Really, that means you need to be highlighting your research in a way that gets people to support it, but, well, that surely should be the role of any academic to make sure that they are getting people on side to support their research. I suppose if you're a mad scientist off in a corner doing something weird, then... But even then, they always seem to get money from somewhere. You notice that you've very rarely, outside of cartoons, have seen a poor mad scientist. But you've seen many poor mad historians. The world could be telling me something. Leave that to one side. Soviet concept of operations. Let's start off there. Well, the Soviet concept of operations basically come down to bastion defense. Now, the bastion defense is about two things. One, it's about defense of the motherland, and two, it's about defense of the motherland. You're going to say, hang on, Alex, didn't you just say the same thing twice? No. Firstly, about the conventional defense, i.e. providing as much defensive depth as possible to prevent NATO naval forces being able to close the gap and getting close to the Soviet Union to launch strikes on Soviet Union territory or support forces in the northern flank of NATO, i.e. Scandinavia. It's always officially considered that only Norway would be involved, but let's be honest, Sweden and Finland, whilst they might have been technically neutral for the entirety of the Cold War, were both fundamentally expecting to get a rapid Russian invasion should any war break out, and be pretty much forced to join the NATO side. That's honestly an assumption which NATO often works on as well. Now the fact they've joined NATO officially, it's just made it a lot easier, but honestly, it was always a basic assumption that at some point the Soviets are going to try and invade them, and they're going to end up being on our side. So, do we have worked out what the contingencies are in that situation? Mm-hmm. Of course, there was a period when it was a case of, well, the Soviets might not invade them before the world goes nuclear, but we'll leave that to one side. There was the idea at one point that any Cold War would, if it went turned hot, would last about 3 days before it went nuclear, so you didn't have to invest in anything. It was mainly an idea which seemed to be attractive to accountants and treasury officials, not to anyone who was actually involved in it. Because for some reason the people who were actually contemplating destruction of the entire planet in nuclear Armageddon were less keen on the idea than accountants who thought that idea would allow them to not spend money on buying expensive defense equipment. It's amazing. Everyone's always thinking it's going to be the generals and the admirals who will end us all. My money's always on the accountants. It always is. The other point for the Bastion, and this is where nuclear war Armageddon comes in, is this was also defensive depth for the nuclear ballistic missile submarines. What the Soviet Union has always considered the war-ending capability. I.e., there might be a nuclear exchange, but you keep the SSBNs because they're the survivable section of your nuclear deterrent, and if the war is carrying on even after a little exchange, they're your capability to go, we want the war to stop, and you're not going to touch Soviet territory. The war is going to stop here. We can't win, but we can both still lose, sort of thing. Now, here's the thing. To do all this, the Soviets have a large naval air force, land-based. But they have a problem. They have a problem with this. Actually defending the task groups and defending it over the distances involved. And specifically intercepting submarines. So you want to have anti-submarine warfare groups out hunting NATO submarine forces. But also intercepting NATO maritime patrol aircraft, which could be operating from Iceland and Greenland, and therefore could be dodging past various sections of Soviet air defense to head into those bastions and try and hunt the ballistic missile submarines. Now, I do say try and hunt, I don't say necessarily successfully hunt, but the Soviets would rather there was no chance, or any chance was as fraught with danger as possible, of that happening. And that's where the Kievs come in, because they can provide security. Now, please note, the bastions are not just a European Northern Fleet thing. They're also a thing in the Black Sea, they're a thing in the Baltic, they're a thing in the Pacific. There are bastions all over the place, and they have different roles, and some of them have ballistic missile submarines, some of them don't, and etc. in them. But they're all about defending the Soviet Union. And that's what the Kievs are for. They're about providing the amphibious task groups with A, command ship, B, this is the anti-submarine warfare task groups. I call them amphibious task groups, but also that as well. They were supposed to do some help with them. They were about providing them with some organic air cover and some ability to intercept enemy scouting aircraft. They're not really the primary fighter air defense of the formation, though. And this is the point that is common with both these types, both these through-deck cruiser classes. Their concept of operations includes a healthy dose of land-based aviation. In the Soviet sense, it's probably a core component of it, an expectation of it. In the British sense, it is something which is in many ways forced upon the Royal Navy, by government and other services, political machinations. And if you're being strict and keeping to purely a NATO theatre, it does make sense that there should be land-based aviation available, and at least in the initial parts of any operations, until those, of course, you either run short of aircraft due to attrition of enemy action, attrition of maintenance, or attrition of the joys of war. All of those are things which will attrit your aviation capabilities. But the point is, as with the Invincibles, which will come later, the Kiev was supposed to be about being an information denial asset. More than an air defense asset, in terms of her air group. Her missile fit, though, let's be honest, that's got a fairly hefty anti-aircraft capability in it. And honestly, she makes a great theme park. She made a fairly good aircraft carrier for the Soviet Union, and I would argue probably were a better fit for their needs than the Kuznetsov. Because once you've gone for the Kuznetsov, you should probably have gone full all the way. The turbo-pressurized boilers are something we're going to discuss in a bit, and the general career service of Kiev was not that massive, not that extensive, but she was useful. She was, when she entered service, something of a shock to the world. Not necessarily to the navies, they'd had time to digest it, time to understand it, but certainly to the media of the world, who had grown used to the Soviet Union being this force which they could in many ways portray as being both a peer threat and a bit backwards. They didn't have the things we'd had. They didn't have them in the same way. They were different. Well, this came out, and the Kievs looked mean. They are festooned with missiles. You only have to look at this earlier picture here. They are festooned with missiles forward, and guns. They are bristling with the weaponry of war, and they're loaded with aircraft. The concept of the battle carrier has risen. There are, and I don't think it was published, but I know I have a friend who was around at the time as a junior academic and basically wrote a paper saying the Soviets had brought the battle carriers to life. I think he ended up renaming the paper and retitling it. But that's the joy of it. But also the interesting factor of it, in that the Soviets had produced something which was still fulfilling the cruiser role of the heavy missile ship in the Soviet Navy, and also providing the limited aviation they really needed. The anti-submarine warfare capability from her large helicopter group, and information denial, perhaps the ability to shoot down some snooping aircraft, some Orions or something like that, when they're popping around. No one was thinking the Yak-38 Forger was going to get into a fight with a Tomcat and win. Literally, there is no one outside of some very, very strange, I'm going to call it fan fiction, because that's the end. I found this, and I'm not going to put a link to it, but I will tell you, if you go search the realms of the internet, of Russian internet, about the Yak-38 Forger, there are some interesting papers which allege that the first Yak Forger could have taken out Tomcats in dogfights, and I don't think so. Honestly, the Yak-38, I don't think it even wants to get into a fight with Sea Harrier. It is not that kind of aircraft. It is an aircraft which was designed to say we had it, not because the Soviet Union was capable of putting enough resources and time into developing it to the level at which they could have done. It's that sort of scenario. It's a case of we need an aircraft for the ships we're designing, and it needs to fit this criteria. I would say they get far more into naval aircraft in the for the carrier for things like the Kuznetsov onwards. And here's where the Royal Navy concept operations come in, and it's surprise, surprise, the same stretch of water. It's better known as the GIUK Gap in NATO terminology, or the Greenland-Iceland-UK Gap, and it is the most artificial choke point known to mankind. The fact there are people who still go around the world going, this is a choke point. No, it's not. A choke point is where the waters narrow, like Gibraltar, the Straits of Gibraltar, or the Straits of Hormuz, or the Straits of Malacca. Notice the phrase going on here? They're where the trade naturally has to flow into smaller points. No, the GIUK Gap is pretty much otherwise known as the North Atlantic. Admittedly, it's the northern part of the North Atlantic, bordering on the Norwegian Sea, but it still is the North Atlantic. And just because you've stuck a line of hydrophones across it, doesn't suddenly make it a choke point. It makes it a line, you attempting to draw a line of defence in the sea. But in this scenario, the Royal Navy has 3 points, 3 duties it has to do. Anti-submarine warfare convoy escorts for convoys across North Atlantic from America and merchant vessels going back to North America, because you have to send the empty ones back to load them up with more stuff to bring and get across. Supporting operations in the North Sea and the Norwegian Sea of Allied forces, i.e. the carrier battle groups of the Strike Fleet of the Commander Strike Fleet Atlantic, and the forces going up with him. And in this period, it's always a him in this period. And landing amphibious forces in Norway, which was supposed to be an administrative landing, but the way the Royal Navy and the Norwegians force of an administrative landing versus the way other people in Ministry of Defence seem to think of an administrative landing was very different, because in the Ministry of Defence, they seem to have treated the phrase administrative landing as being, you'll land and you don't expect even the Soviets to be attacking with aircraft. Whereas the Royal Navy and Royal Marines and Norwegian approach to it was, we're probably going to have to put down in a fjord somewhere because all the ports are going to be being hit. We're going to want to hide alongside the side of the fjord so the ships blend into the fjords as much as possible to make it very difficult for missiles to target them. Because, as I've discussed before when talking about the Falklands War, to quote Michael Clarke, who was the Amphibious Task Group Commander in the Falklands War and was a very experienced buccaneer observer and had been a squadron commander and all sorts of things in the Royal Navy Fleet Air Arm, rock beats missile. Simple. Rock might lose to paper, but it beats missile. Because if the aircraft and the systems can't get a lock on you before they pass over you at high speed, because there's a giant rock in the way, you're safe. So you hide in the fjords and make life as difficult for the enemy as possible, and they're going to have to come in and bomb you deep in the fjords. And that's going to mean they're going to have to charge into the air defences, which were mostly going to be supplied by the Norwegians and the various air defence regiments attached to 3rd Commando Brigade. Because that was a split job, and because it was a shared job, that was used as justification for not having necessarily as many of those Rapier air defence systems in 3rd Commando Brigade as 3rd Commando Brigade would probably have liked. But there again, you find a brigade commander in the entirety of the Cold War who's happy with their number of artillery assets, and B, their number of air defense assets, or C, their engineering assets, or D, their logistics assets. I don't think I've met one who was happy with their numbers and their quotas at all. They always go, but I could have done with this or that, or, you know. So, in this scenario, again, the Royal Navy was being told, well, you don't need carriers, because in this scenario, we're going to provide your air defense. You're going to have fighter coverage from Norway, fighter coverage from Scotland, it's all fighter coverage from Iceland, fighter coverage from the American carrier battle groups. It's all going to be done for you. And the Royal Navy successfully fights a rearguard action and basically goes, well, yes, but the trouble is the Soviet scout aircraft, they're coming out to find us. If we can shoot them down before they locate us, that's going to ease the burden on your air defense assets to do what you're primarily supposed to be doing, defending Norway, defending the north of the defending the United Kingdom, defending Iceland, and supporting the carrier battle groups as they're going through. You don't want to, us little groups, you don't really want to be supporting. You know, we want to get across safely, but if we can take out their scouting aircraft to provide that level of defense, then we're safe, right? Because they're not going to retask satellites to hunt us. They're not going to retask the satellites. So every time the satellites are going overhead, we can pop in a different direction, or we can blow smoke, or do all sorts of things. Or do all sorts of other things we do to try and interfere with satellites. But, you know, it's reconnaissance aircraft, it's the Bear Fs and the other systems going out hunting for us that are going to be the problem, because they'll guide in the heavy bombers, which are bringing the heavy missile strike. And we can't deal with those, so we prefer to take out the enemy scouts before they do that. And also, are you going to have enough fighters over us to help us with dealing with those sort of threats if they come find us and come in for us? Because your fighters are going to have to return to base to rearm. That's always the thing forgotten. Whenever they draw a circle around any airfield and go, you don't need carriers because we can provide air defense in all this area, ask this question. So, what happens when your fighters have run out of missiles because they've engaged the enemy and have to return to base? They have to fly all the way that way to rearm, and whatever's coming out to replace the one station is having to fly all that way as well. That's the whole advantage of a carrier. It's at the point it's in the task group, and the fighters therefore are operating from the thing which is under attack. So they're never going out of the area of engagement. Which is why they can have the quick turnaround and why you can keep a constant presence. Because they haven't got that huge distance to cover. So, the Royal Navy's concept operations for the Invincible class pretty much comes down to a flagship, a diplomatic ship and status ship, a vessel which is going to provide some very strong anti-submarine warfare protection, kind of taking over from the Tiger class in this, but even better, providing more helicopters for ASW operations, because again, the big threat from the Soviets, apart from the bombers toting a huge number of missiles, are of course the submarines. The Cold War was all about the submarines. It really was. This is why submariners become so important in all the different naval services and basically dominate them for that period, because the Cold War becomes all about the submarines and all about the subfights. And there are good reasons for that. But it's kind of like the Grand Fleet in World War One. In that scenario, it makes a lot of sense. But in a wider, more global conflict, then it's a more balanced force you probably need than a submarine-orientated force. Especially for managing the peacetime conflicts and managing the risk of conflict. So they have all that. They have all those different roles. Those cruiserish roles. And then on top of that, they have a few fighters to intercept scout aircraft. And considering the way the Royal Navy immediately starts to tool them up, and the people they pick to fly them, you very quickly get the sense that it's more than that. It's also about providing a layer of defensive security. It's not going to be much, but it's going to be something. Something to deal with those, to support the air defense against those strikes coming in. Something you can launch to maybe cover gaps between land-based air coverage. Because people like Sharky Ward, they come from the Phantoms. The fact that they pick such a heavy amount, such a large amount of Phantom pilots, of fighter pilots, who've been trained to be very aggressive fighter pilots in the traditional Royal Navy mould, because the traditional Royal Navy fighter mould is to dive into enemy formations to break them up, disregarding the sheer numbers of the enemy formation, the fact they outnumber you, but to dive in to break them up. These are the people they pick to lead and form the backbone strength and experience strength of their Sea Harrier squadrons. Which makes Invincible a new mould? Sorry, had to go win an argument with PowerPoint, my lovely American assistant. So, a new mould. Honestly, it's both a new mould and an old one for the Royal Navy, as once again they are trying to work out where to go. I have to say, one of the big things with this ship is that the name made it through the naming committee. After World War I, after the Battle of Jutland, Invincible as a name doesn't make it through the committee. There are other times it is considered. It was put forward, there are ideas for it. I even heard some people talk about it being for the 6th Illustrious class. There was a comment the other day. There are only 4 Illustrious class, and that's including Formidable, which is a subclass of them. Implacable and Indefatigable are a separate class, and whilst they come from the same design study, are not of the same class, not of the same design, and they are orientated from the beginning as a strike cruiser role, a strike carrier role, rather than just a pure fleet carrier role. The first generation armoured hangar carriers. Invincible is never considered. It's kind of like Hood hasn't returned, and a few other names don't return after they get lost. They don't. It's a very big thing to bring back a name. In many ways, Invincible was chosen because they didn't want to do another Illustrious class, and they didn't want to do a direct link with World War II, but they wanted to bring the Illustrious along into it because of World War II, because of the status of the name. And so you have to be careful what name has a suitable status. Naming Invincible when its predecessor was the first battle cruiser sort of also sets up another thing. It sets up, like the battle cruisers, the Royal Navy's taking a leap into something new. Which, as I've mentioned before, thanks to the Kievs, they really weren't. But the thing was, it looked and sounded new enough, and sounded cool enough, that it got through all the fiery hoops and pitfalls of procurement that are common in British procurement. And what you ended up getting was a aviation vessel orientated around the helicopters on it. Again, it's like the CVA-1, its design is as much orientated around the upcoming future Merlins as it is around the Sea Kings. You have to remember, one of the fun things about the Merlin program, and what becomes the Merlin program, is it's coming for a long time before it enters service. It's coming for a long time. They're talking about the next generation helicopter, the thing that's going to come after the Sea King, almost as soon as the Sea King enters service. And yeah, there's that as all the whole way through. It has centerline lifts rather than deck edge lifts. Interesting question to my mind is whether that's attached to the through deck cruiser thing, or whether that is some sort of attempt at cost saving, or whether it's to make it look less like a big American carrier. But it always seemed to me to be the most stupid thing to do, because you're not dealing with treaty limits, and if you'd had deck edge lifts, the amount of extra space you'd included in the hangars would have been dramatic. But honestly, there are lots of compromises forced in on this design. I would say they're shorter and smaller than even the Royal Navy would have liked them to be. There are certainly enough designs put through which were bigger, usually longer, and whilst none of the designs featured deck edge lifts per se, they were certainly discussed. But ultimately, these were the through-deck cruisers. These were to be the cornerstone of the Royal Navy's new west of Suez focused fleet. The trouble is they were going to spend a lot of their life operating east of Suez, and a lot of their life most famously operating in the South Atlantic, and various things which were completely outside of the concept of operations or the area of operations conceived for their operation when they're constructed. Let's be honest, the first basic criteria for Invincible when she's being built and she's being designed is that she will always be operating within, when she's fighting a threat, either a peer or near peer, she'll be operating within range of friendly land-based fighter cover. And airborne early warning cover. That's a big factor in why the Royal Navy has plans for a Sea King airborne early warning variant, but haven't executed on them or pushed them forward, because getting funding out of the Ministry of Defence which is going, but you're always going to have sentries. Either ours, or Allied ones, or Hawkeyes from US and French carriers. Why do you need them? You're always going to be under airborne early warning from allies. Why do you need to spend money on this? I've talked in a recent video about aircraft carriers post-1945, supercarriers versus specialists, about the fact that carriers grant nations a level of freedom if they're done properly in terms of action. Those decisions you make, like airborne early warning, like the size of a carrier, how many fighters it can carry, how many below 18 it can carry, and we're going to be getting into air group size later on in this video. Well, those things have an impact on your freedom of action. Those things affect your ability to be independent. Now, Invincible famously serves in the Falklands War. She goes down there with Hermes, which is bigger, and carries a far larger percentage of the Harriers and Sea Harriers involved in the conflict, because she has the space to, and does her best. I've seen spec'd up plans for making an Invincible be able to operate 18 Sea Harriers and about the same number or more of Sea Kings, which involve deck parking and 24-hour flying and all sorts of ideas. And really, that's pushing it beyond its envelope. But what Invincible accomplishes in the Falklands with the air group she has is nothing short of amazing. Even against a near-peer threat which is dealing with the significant geographic and geostrategic issues that the Argentines are dealing with, as well as the internal political issues the Argentines are dealing with. It is exceptionally useful as an asset. And before anyone gets into it too much, no, it was not sunk by the Argentinians. I'm sorry. Every time I've seen that claim... Here's the thing. I'm not disputing that the Argentinians couldn't, if they managed to hit the Invincible with enough missiles, sink it. They could have done. I'm disputing the fact that they think, A, the British government could cover it up, and B, the British government could build an aircraft carrier quickly enough, another one of these quickly enough, to replace it. Those are the disputes. Those are the points which disprove it. Any conspiracy theory, which includes another government managing to perfectly conceal such a massive piece of news, hide it from the world, and produce another ship in time to fill in for its role, is just not serious. I'm sorry. There are many conspiracy theories which I'll look at and go, well, whilst I don't actually agree with it, I can see the logic behind you, and I there is some plausibility going on there. Anything which relies on governments keeping such a massive thing secret as all those people dying, especially in the Falklands War, when you've got so many different journalists wandering around all the time and popping up all sorts of weird places, isn't going to happen. Just isn't going to happen. The British are not that good at obeying their government for that to happen. So here we go. So far I've talked about the Yak-38 Forger, and I've talked about the Sea Harrier, but this is what they look like. Now again, the Forger had entered service before the Sea Harrier, but not before the Harrier. There's an important distinction there. One of the interesting things with the Sea Harrier is that the Royal Navy gets to take the Harrier concept and Harrier idea and have a long conversation with Hawker Siddeley and somehow get an aircraft which is about as related to the Harrier at the time as the Super Hornet is the Hornet. In that they both have called Harrier, and they have similar engines in them. In that there's only some modifications made to make it better for dealing with saltwater, honestly, Governor. And all sorts of things, but yeah. There are differences going on here. There are big differences. Now here's the interesting thing. The Yak-38 is in many ways an aircraft which shows the Soviet Union's interest in going to sea, but also their relative inexperience in going to sea in terms of naval aviation, and it's a developing point for them. The Sea Harrier. The Sea Harrier is the Royal Navy using every bit of history and experience it has available to it, every industrial contact, every relationship, every friendship, every favour it is owed, to ensure that the aircraft it receives is better than it's billed to be. Now, whilst the Sea Harrier 2 is something which is really, truly special as an aircraft in the Cold War, the original Sea Harrier should be given props. It's a good aircraft. It's a solid aircraft. It's a reliable aircraft. Admittedly, as originally designed, they burnt through starters, like I burned through bottles of iron brew, but leaving that to one side, they were pretty darn good, and that starter problem was fixed as they were en route down to the Falkland Islands, quite literally. The Royal Navy knew it was a problem, but while there was not a war going on, even the justification of the Cold War didn't pay for the fix. the moment Argentina invaded the Falklands, they managed to get it justified and get the fix. Mostly thanks to a gentleman called Professor Edward Bromhead, who did a lot of testing. A lot of testing. The Yak 38 Forger. Honestly, that's a hard aircraft to pin down in some ways. As said, it has a limited interception role more than air defense role, and a reconnaissance role. But honestly, the Soviets like to try and push it for more. It's a status symbol. It's faster, and that was the big criteria for them, was it had to be faster than the Harrier. It had to be faster. And that, in many ways, forced compromises in the design, because an obsession with speed has never produced a balanced aircraft or a balanced warship, has it? But they tried. They tried. And certainly those serving aboard the Minsk, which featured here, did well for the Soviet Union. They did. And the Minsk herself is currently almost a theme park. She's not been quite scrapped according to the latest information I've seen, but she isn't quite a theme park. She keeps getting close, but the people who are planning to do it keep shutting down due to lack of funds, because running an aircraft carrier, even as a theme park, is expensive. Even a relatively small one, which is just, 40-something thousand tons, is not cheap. Now, Minsk's real great point, real point of status, comes after the Sino-Vietnamese War, where she's sent by the Soviet Union to the South China Sea to go and visit Vietnam. As has often been discussed by those who are talking about the Cold War and focusing on the end of it specifically, the gap between Maoism and the form of communism adopted after Stalin has passed in the Soviet Union grows and causes issues between them and fissures between them. This leads to a lot of interesting politics on both sides, and politics in the West as well because of it. But the reality is that you have the Sino-Vietnamese War, which is a vicious conflict and a vicious border fight. And afterwards, the Soviet Union keeps sending Minsk, which is pretty much acting as the Pacific Fleet's flagship at this point, down there with a task group. She conducts the first amphibious landings of the Soviet Union forces in Vietnam. She, with the help of a landing ship, of course, she visits the various critical port facilities, making use of lots of facilities which have been installed by American money. It's very useful for her to do so. In other words, she is used as a diplomatic messaging tool. A very big, very heavy, very much look at us, look what we're deploying. And again, this is probably the scenario which starts to lead to the Soviets going, hang on, we probably need an actual proper aircraft carrier. Because whilst you can make the case for a carrier with such a limited air group operating within range of Allied land-based airfields and Allied land-based air support, the moment you have a vessel going to the South China Sea from the Pacific Fleet, you are an awful long way away from support. And yes, you can argue, well, they've got their allies, the Vietnamese, there. Yes, but the Vietnamese have just been through a massive war and possibly don't want to get involved in another one. The Chinese are potentially allies, potentially adversaries, because you've also been fighting wars against them. And you've got a lot of bits of water to pass through, which are definitely not friendly. In fact, you couldn't be more on your own if you tried. Well, you can actually, because she then goes to the Indian Ocean as well. In that time, she visits the Indian Ocean. There is no support there. There's often discussions about why the Soviet Union maintains forces in the Indian Ocean, and it is completely the ultimate. We're going to have some forces here because you're going to have to send something to deal with us. Not because it's of any real value in terms of combat power. It's more valuable in terms of how much of your forces it's going to draw away from the critical areas to come and engage us. Because you're going to have to bring a more powerful force than we have to take it out. And be sure you're going to take it out. And if you want to take it out with reasonable safety and reasonable assuredness of taking it out, you're going to have to send even more forces. The Indian Ocean is one great big force suck. Vortex for for NATO forces, basically. You have to send something to deal with the Soviet threat there, because of the way it will overlap trade routes and critical movements of goods and all those things going through the Indian Ocean. But it's a long way away from anywhere where those forces could actually be useful for major operations. It just is. Next point in the aggro mix are the helicopters. The Westling Sea Kings versus the Kamov K-25s. Now, yes, the Kamov K-25s are supplemented later on by 27s and 29s, but for differing roles. But those don't come into service till after the Soviet Union's already been playing around with the Kievs for a while and gone, you know what, we can use them for more than this. You can actually mentally see the light bulb moment of going, these are cool, these are useful. What else can we do with them? What else can we do with this? That's often the way when it comes to aircraft carriers, because ultimately, at their base point, any aircraft carrier, or through-deck cruiser, as we're discussing today, are large spaces which are adaptable. They're flexible. They're literally empty boxes. What you stick in a box is up to you. You can decide how to make use of the space in that box, and it's the same for navies with a hangar. It's a large, empty space. It's why the Absalon class of the Danish Navy with their flex deck are considered so amazing. Because basically the flex deck is a hangar without the requirement of being a hangar. Because they're not an aircraft carrier. Now, ultimately though, these aircraft do represent a different design philosophy when it comes to helicopters, and a different modus operandi in some ways of operation and focuses on operation. And this difference is best illustrated by the size differential in what we're dealing with. Whilst they both have 4 crew when they're on anti-submarine warfare duties and can be flown by an air crew of 2 when they're not, the only area where the Kamov K-25 Hormone, as NATO like to call it, exceeds the Sea King is in its height. There's a reason for this. The Hormone is a very small aircraft. It is designed to be able to be fit in the most minimal space you can possibly provide it. Both are designed to be similarly rugged and as independent in anti-submarine warfare as possible within the capabilities of the nation supporting them. But whereas the Western Sea King, which is not the same as the Sikorsky aircraft. The British do a number of modifications to it. It's basically Western for many years pretty much takes Sikorsky aircraft and turn them into British equivalents, with usually Rolls-Royce engines and all sorts of things added in, and all sorts of extra electronics and things. It's the closest example I can give you is what the Japanese tended to do with the Royal Navy's pre-dreadnought. That's the Royal Navy's Royal Sovereign style battleship designs, where because they were only building one or two, they would pay for things in that aircraft, or pay for things in that ship, that frankly didn't make sense for the Royal Navy when they're buying 8, because those expenses over 7 can pay for the 8th extra aircraft. And it's the same for the Royal Navy and Britain with the Westland Sea King versus the Sikorsky Sea King. There are things they're going to pay for that make sense at the scale they're building them, which don't necessarily make sense when you're buying at the scale the Americans or other powers are buying them at. But capable, and definitely useful. Interesting enough, they have a similar speed. I should be honest, actually. Technically, the Hormone's top speed is 113 knots, and the cruising speed, not the top speed, the cruising speed for the Sea King is 112 knots. So, at maximum speed, the Hormone can overtake the Sea King at cruising speed. Hormone's cruising speed is 104 knots. But the thing is, they are completely different aircraft and airframe types in terms of their scale. The British have chosen a far larger aircraft. Now, the question is why? Both are looking for anti-submarine warfare capability. Both are looking to maximise it. The question is why the British take up precious space on their carrier, which is limited, because it's not the biggest carrier in the world, with the bigger Sea King, rather than using, let's say, another aircraft they have available, Lynx, which is also an anti-submarine warfare helicopter. Well, the scope and level of capabilities within the Sea King's systems are better than the equivalent Lynx at the time, which makes it justifiable. But also, the thing is, the Kamov K-25 is an additional extra layer of anti-submarine warfare beyond the land-based helicopters, the land-based aircraft, and the ships themselves. It's extra formation. It's about supplementing it. Whereas for the Royal Navy, the Sea Kings, they're chosen, were because in the middle of the Atlantic, or in the North Atlantic, or in any of the areas around Norway, whilst they might be told that for fighter defence and air defence there will be fighters in range, everyone at every point is telling them there is going to be no support for their anti-submarine warfare efforts, because those are expected to be, is also expected to be so stretched thin by the Soviet submarines, especially trying to defend the GI-UK gap, that there's going to be nothing on call. So this is what you choose when you're maximising efficiency in space as part of your force. This is what you pick when this is going to be the emphasis of your force. But, yes, they do take up, how do I put this politely? These come in at 4.7 tons. Roughly. That's 10,500 pounds. These that's empty weight, by the way. These come in at 6.3, nearly 6.4 tons. That's 14,000 pounds. And their maximum weight when they're fully loaded, well, this gets up to 7.5 tons. This goes up to 9.5 tons, or 16,500 pounds versus 21,000, nearly 21,500 pounds. It's a big beast. and it's about the emphasis on anti-submarine warfare, but also the real differences in the terms of the operational requirements. Now, please note, there are also some interesting factors going on at play. The Ka-25 is actually designed with some abilities to alight on water, to land on water, whereas you really don't want to land a Sea King on the water. You do not. They might have a mildly boat-shaped underneath, but honestly, do not land them anywhere near water. They do not enjoy it. There are easier ways to lose a Sea King. There really are. But both types carried a large array of weapons, and both proved quite appropriate for their nation's requirements of them, which is always a good thing. Now, here we have Illustrious, which was the second Invincible class, and honestly, I can't think of a better illustration of the reality of building an aircraft carrier. One of those is a nuclear-powered supercarrier with nearly 100 aircraft aboard. One of those is a gas turbine Vistol carrier with definitely not 100 aircraft aboard. But then look at the size similarity. Yes, the American carrier is roughly 100,000 tons, and the British carrier is 22,000 tons. But honestly, the proportion of the British carrier, which is devoted to engines and hotel facilities, as it's called, for staff for keeping the crew alive, basically, before anyone starts going, oh, this means they're on a fun cruise, etc. No. A hotel load on a ship is what the things are for keeping the crew alive. So kitchens, accommodations, food storage, basically all those things. And they're called the hotel load because that's basically what it is, isn't it? I suppose the other option you could call it is the lodgings load, but that doesn't sound right. Then you could, I suppose you could, do you want to call it the dormitory load, but that sounds wrong as well. You end up going down the list and find out that hotel really is the only practical word to use for it. When you consider, though, the larger carrier, whilst it's going to have larger, more powerful engines to move it because of its size, they usually take up less percentage of space, less of the overall hull in percentages terms, allowing more of the hull to be devoted to aviation. Which is why, with aircraft carriers, the bigger you build them, usually the more efficient they get in terms of aviation, up until about a certain point. Honestly, 60 to 90 aircraft, you're in a fairly decent operating scenario. Once you get over that, that's when humanity starts to break down, and the ability of humans, no matter how good your systems, to run things starts to break down. That was found in the confined areas of carriers during World War II, and it's been tested again since at various points during the Cold War. The US have tried to have max loaded their carriers and have found very quickly that, yeah, once we get a little over the 90 mark, if things start to become problematic, there start to be issues, and it's the humans involved. But the point that also should be realised here, though, and the important thing here, is the image of these two carriers next to each other. That's a sign of commitment. It doesn't matter it's so much smaller than the American one. It's a sign of national commitment. And it's also nice to have them together because that and its capabilities were used as part of justification for building just this. For even it not getting... Well, it did actually have airborne early warning Sea Kings when it first deployed into operations because they were rapidly put into service to go down with Illustrious at the end of the Falklands War, when she came into service. So, yeah, her first operations, her literal first operation, she comes out, she's commissioned, she goes charging down to the Falklands arriving just after the war's over as part of the relief group. And then she's the guardian there of preserving peace, making sure no one tries to push anything, no one tries to do anything. And for that, she's got Sea King AEW aircraft, airborne early warning. I would say that's the other difference in these two, in that whilst the Kamov K-25 hormone can do troop transport, it's done very well, in fact, doing troop transport at points, and especially with special force insertions for the Soviets, and has very good anti-submarine warfare. This was capable of doing a huge amount of operations in the Falklands with very quick work. They converted some of the anti-submarine warfare Sea Kings to actually doing some extra lifts at certain points for using them for the heavy lifts, and of course a lot of them were commando variant, doing commando transport, and those pilots. Look at these helicopters. Would you want to be driving them so low next to the ground that you have to rise up to deploy your landing gear? If you wouldn't, then you are part of the sane majority of people in this planet. If you would, then I suggest you fill out an application form for the Fleet Air Arm of the Royal Navy and select to go to the Commando Helicopter Force, because they still do the same, but with Merlins now. You will have fun and have all your heart's desires of low flying, of occasionally having sheep go up your windshield rather than under your aircraft because of how you hit them. No, I don't think they've ever actually been foddered by a sheep. I don't think they've ever been taken out by a sheep, but, you know, they've come close a few times. And I'm 90% sure the stories I've heard about that are spinning dits, which is basically when you take a true story, it's got to have a grain of truth in it, and you elaborate it so much in terms of perspective and storytelling that whilst it's still technically a true story, if you didn't know what the actual true part of it was, you could be mistaken for thinking it was a godly appearance. So now we're into the vitals comparison, and this is the first core area, the vessels themselves. Now, in terms of displacement, the Kievs, as said, they are roughly twice the displacement of the Invincibles. Not exactly twice, because the Kievs top out at 45,000 tons, and the Invincibles top out at 24,251 tons. But it's close enough that, frankly, it should have worried some people when they were signing off on the Invincibles. Length, 273 meters for the Kiev, that's 896 feet, to 209 meters or 686 feet for the Invincible. Beam, 53 meters for the Kiev, or at 31 meters at the waterline, 36 meters for the Invincible. That's basically for overalls 118 to 174 feet. Draft for the Kiev, 10 meters, that's 33 foot. For the Invincible, 8 meters, 26 foot. And befitting its larger size and capabilities, the Kiev has 8 turbo-pressurized boilers driving 4 steam turbines to supply 4 shafts with 200,000 shaft horsepower for a top speed of 32 knots. The Invincible, rather unsurprisingly for a Royal Navy-produced vessel, has a combined gas and gas, that's COGAG, with 2 Rolls-Royce or Olympus TM38 gas turbines connected to each of the 2 shafts. This means they have a total of 4 turbines. And also meant that if you took a turbine down for maintenance, you could still run your shaft on 1 turbine, so you could still do some cruising speed. This provides a total of 100,000 shaft horsepower from the 4 for a top speed of 28 knots, or a range of 7,000 nautical miles at 18 knots. And they also had 8 Paxman Valletta diesel generators to supply the hotel load. Whereas you see modern systems would be diesel and gas combined electric, both putting electric power and electric main, and then you can have electric drive on the shafts to transmit the power, so you could do the cruising speed with your diesel engines and then turn on the high speed with the gas turbines, or vice versa. If you wanted to take the diesels off for maintenance, you could keep going with the gas turbines alone. They didn't do that with the Invincibles. Again, it's one of those things they could have done at the time, actually. There are systems available at the time. But reliability was what they were going for, and they decided direct drive of the turbines to the shafts was the best option. I would also say I would take the top speed of both those vessels with a pinch of salt. For starters, 100,000 shaft horsepower on that hull shaping, etc. in the Invincibles. Considering what 100,000 shaft horsepower has apparently reached in the past with similar hull shapings for the Royal Navy, 28 knots does not seem quite correct. It could be that the Royal Navy completely mucked up the Invincibles' hydrodynamics and made them far too brick-like going through the water, but that's unlikely. As for the Kievs, well, similarly, but there is the reality that they had issues with their engines the entire time. Not as much as the Kuznetsov and subsequent vessels. The generation turbo-pressurized boilers seem to be quite good in the Kiev hull form, and seem to be far more reliable, as long as they're well maintained. Now, this could be because of their service career. It could be that because their career was during the latter part of the Soviet Union, they were mostly not part of the Soviet or Russian Navy after the fall of the Soviet Union, and etc. So they were not subjected to the same issues and the same lapses in maintenance that Kuznetsov has been. And let's be honest, steam boilers are at the best of times. How do I put this? They can be incredibly reliable, but as long as you treat them right. They are things which require gentling, which require care, which require attention. And something which is a turbo-pressurized boiler requires a lot of gentling and attention. But, yeah. Mostly, I reckon 32 knots is not quite right for their top speed, and I'm sure 28 knots isn't right for the Invincibles. But this brings us to Novorossiysk, which is generation 1.5, because, yeah, it's an interesting time when we're looking at these ships. It truly is. You see, the Kievs are built in a batch of 2, the first 2, Kiev and Minsk. And then Novorossiysk is built, and then Baku or Admiral Gorshkov is built. And each one has a slightly... the last 2 has slightly different fits. This is why I tend to call them Generation 1 for the Kiev and Minsk, Generation 1.5 for Novorossiysk, and Generation 2 for the Baku, aka Admiral Gorshkov, which is actually the last vessel we'll be going to today. Now, the Novorossiysk is an interesting vessel. It has an extremely Soviet career, one could say. A good example of this being that provided by Dr. Donald Chapman in, I think, his article in the Air Power Journal from the summer 1990, which was the transformation of Soviet maritime air operations and implications for US maritime strategy. I'm going from my notes here. I copied and pasted this article a long time ago, and I'm not sure where exactly I got it from. I do know it was from that. It was in that. It was in the Air Power Journal, but it's just I copied it a long time ago. This is the trouble when you have files going back a long time. There were times when you were not necessarily as good with your remembering to reference it as you are now, or rather, you hadn't learnt the lessons of. I'll remember this. No, you don't. You honestly don't. Anyway, the example he gives, and I'll talk about other data as well about this particular operation, was that in March of 1985, the carrier Novorossiysk and an escorting task force departed the Sea of Japan, sailed to the South of Okinawa, and then made their way east across the Pacific. After approximately 8 days, the ships turned and headed northwest towards the Kuri Islands, simulating an enemy carrier strike against the Soviet Union. As Novorossiysk approached the islands, about 700 miles east of Japan, Bears flew reconnaissance missions near the battle group and helped to vector some 20 backfires to their targets. He then goes further to provide a quote from a US naval report on the issue, that had itself been quoted, I think, in Richard Gross's Soviet Naval Forces Simulated US Aircraft Carrier Attack of Jane's Defense Weekly in 27th April 1985, but I haven't been able to find that article. I was able to find this one and have this, but I haven't been able to track down that article or a copy of that. Not in free sources without paying Jane's a lot of money. Anyway, I'll get there eventually. Anyway, the quote is, "The force was hit by simulated airstrikes and probably by submarines firing torpedoes and cruise missiles from about 1,120 kilometers east of Japan on 14th April. They came up with submarines and aircraft, everything they had. The entire attacks and exercises were coordinated with submarine strikes, and honestly, at a certain point you start to realize that the Soviets are capable of, by this point, mounting very serious carrier operations, but also what they're defending against. And in their plans, of course, on the other side of that bastion, as well as all these aircraft attacking the ships coming in, could well be carrier battle groups of their own. That's what they have the Novorossiysk for. That's what they have her sister Minsk for. That's why they're in the Pacific Fleet. They are there to try and provide as much defensive depth as possible, as much reconnaissance capability as possible, and as much strike coordination as possible. Because one of the things that the Soviets are always having trouble dealing with is coordinating forces. Communications equipment, how do I put this, is always an issue for the Soviets because it's very fiddly, very high-tech equipment that doesn't necessarily suit their production methodologies, because they can either produce some very, very high-tech gear in small amounts or very rugged gear in large amounts. And the trouble is, communication gear you need to have both in large amounts, and it also is very fiddly. Now, there is a often discussion as to why command economies have trouble with equipment which fits in these areas, and the argument could well be that command economies tend to set metrics which are easy to watch people by, whereas the free market economy can be more complex in terms of its because people aren't setting the metrics in terms of a thing which you can sort of identifiable figure, but in terms of whether people are willing to buy it or not. So if it doesn't work on all levels, it isn't good. Because in command economies, you're either asking for a quantity of something or a quality of something. And if you're asking for both a quality and quantity of something, that's usually a metric which is going to end up getting a lot of people killed. So people avoid that. And it might not just be you, the person who's setting it, who gets the experience to the lovely refined stay of the gulags. It could be your family. It could be the person above you as well, and it could be the person as well as the people below you. It's a fun experience. So this is probably why comms gear, especially, tends to have issues. And some would also say it's down to the microprocessor technology of what the Soviets were able to produce, what they had. These things are certainly a factor in it. But it does mean that usually Soviet task groups are slightly smaller and are concentrated on these command ships, which is why the carriers have a command ship role, why you have the battle cruisers of the Kirov's class, and why some of the ideas of, oh, the Soviets could put together a battle group which would include a Kuznetsov or Tbilisi class attack carrier, a Kiev class carrier, a Kirov class battle cruiser, two Kara class cruisers, and some Udaloy and submarine class destroyers. That's more of a task force than a task group, because each of those ships, the Kirov, the Kiev, and Tbilisi, are probably going to have their own task group around them, because that's how they can usually work and command and control and communicate with the things. Because they don't really do the same integrated command because of the systems they have available to do it. They approach it in different ways, which have advantages and disadvantages, and are not something I want to get into in too much detail today, because that is probably something I should have covered more in Year of Technology. But honestly, Soviet radio gear and getting into the full discussions with Western radio gear is a very easy way to end up crossing the Wikipedia rule and going into stuff which is not public information. And for those who've never heard of the Wikipedia rule is a rule which academics and a fair number of other commentators use when they're talking about equipment which can still be in service. The rule is we don't want to put anything out which has not been disclosed, because we don't want to violate any secrecy agreements or anything which we might know and get other people in trouble who've told us stuff who maybe shouldn't have told us stuff, or presumed that we had access to stuff and then told us stuff, and then we went, hadn't heard that, so thank you, but we'll keep that under wraps. So basically we go with what are the Wikipedia stats. I also tend to use the rule that if it's been published in a book, it's called the Wikipedia rule because Wikipedia is for the quick, but also the thing is, if it's been published in a book like this, my view is it's also fine. But Wikipedia rule is what the catches in, because if it's on Wikipedia, no one can claim it's secret. If someone tries to claim the stats that are revealed on Wikipedia are secret, they are basically being idiots. But saying that, I would expect that Soviet naval force to have a high degree of cooperation between those task groups and a high degree of support from land-based aviation and submarines also integrated in it. One of the advantages of having a command and control system which basically relies on you talking more to home is it's easier to integrate submarines into that. Because as we saw with the Falklands War in 1982, whilst there were various officers in the task groups down in the South Atlantic who could have communicated with the submarines, they didn't. And so the task groups were often communicating with each other and coordinating with each other. The task force commander was back in Northwood. Sandy Woodward was not task force commander, just clarifying that. He was carrier battle group commander. He's often said to be task force commander, all these things, but no, for various reasons, mostly to do with to do with status. No one wanted to and risk of losing. No one wanted to deploy a vice admiral down south, which would have been a gentleman called Derek Raffel, who would have been a task force commander. And the only way they could do it, could therefore keep it where there wasn't a vice admiral being deployed, is if they kept the admiral in charge back in the UK. So the task force command all had to be done with through him, and that meant all the submarine coordinations were up at that level as well, which caused fun and integration of British submarines in the Falklands. But with the Soviet force, because they're already designed to do that, they're not, as the British had in terms of NATO operations, been designed to be able to communicate with submarines and try and work it themselves. It's always a fraught and technically problematic thing. The Soviets are designed around this concept of basically command and control from home. That's their fleet and coordination, and the higher task force and higher level is this sort of command and control from home. And to integrate with the wider land force, land-based naval aviation, and the submarine arm. And so when we say that force is going to be handled differently, it will be handled differently. But that doesn't make it any less lethal. It just makes it different. And you can disrupt that in different ways than you can disrupt the NATO system. So let's consider vitals comparison once we get further, and here's where things get really interesting, because I can tell you more, in some ways, about the sensor fits on the Kievs than I can about the Invincibles. And even then, I am going to tell you their names, and I'm not going to get into too much detail about them. Now, as time goes on, I might revisit and do a video which is entirely titled the Kiev class and their electronic warfare equipment and sensors, and I might even compare it to the Invincibles. But that's going to be when I'm fairly certain that nothing in there is going to cause trouble. And at the moment, I'm not 100% sure. So let's consider this, shall we? Now, the Kievs, they have, and please note I've used some of the NATO names for the radars, because the coding names just become even more confusing, because some of them look like they're exactly the same, and they're not. They're actually very different systems. They're evolutions or adaptations, and so it's almost easier to keep to the NATO names, which are actually slightly easier to differentiate. So you've got 4 fire control radars of the Bass Tilt type, 2 Don 2 navigation radars, 1 Don K navigation radar, 2 headlight fire control radars, 2 Owl Screech fire control radars, 2 Pot Group fire control radars, 1 Trapdoor C fire control radar, 1 Top Sail 3D air search radar, and 1 Top Steer 3D air search, and that's for Kiev and Minsk. And you can start to see the changes as you go down between the Kiev, Minsk, then the Novorossiysk, and then the Baku. And you can also see the electronic warfare changes. Now, what realistically is the differential here between why the Kievs have such a massive weapons fit, sensor fit versus the Invincible is because of the weapons fit they have versus the Invincible. The Invincible has sea darts and close-in weapon systems. That's what they are basically designed around. That's their weapons, and air coordination. The Kievs, as said before, are both cruisers and carriers. They are expected to still fulfill the cruiser role within the Soviet force structure, and that means they're carrying a lot of heavy weapons. Because the Soviet plan to overwhelm NATO carrier battle groups and NATO forces is fundamentally simple. It is truly not a, startling revelation, but it is absolutely deadly. It's you coordinate and fire as many weapons as you can and overload the enemy systems. They want to have heavy missiles coming in from all the ships they can, from all the submarines they can, from all the aircraft they can, at the same time. And preferably from multiple different directions, to spread the enemy's attention. This happens in Red Storm Rising. It's one of the key parts of the book written by Tom Clancy. And when the Soviets pull it off, it's devastating. Because you can expend your entire missile load for an Aegis cruiser or anything else. And there are still weapons coming in. And if they've got jammers going on, if they've got other sensors coming in, they've got all sorts of things coming through to provide extra cover coordinated with those missiles, then you've got a real problem. The whole point, you can argue, of Allied efforts, of NATO efforts, would be to disrupt that, to prevent them being able to launch such a coordinated strike. So that you get a strike from, let's say, the aircraft at one point, then the ships, and then the submarines. As I often talked about in the Battle of Atlantic, you can make the convoy war incredibly incredibly easy for the Royal Navy if the Germans just build submarines from prior to World War II and don't build any surface ships, because suddenly you have made your threat one-dimensional. It's the same with the missile strikes. If you have the missiles coming in from one direction and one type, that is actually quite easy to manage and control. It's still going to carry a lot of risk, but in terms of complexity of the situation to manage, it's point radars in the correct direction and just keep firing missiles until they're dealt with. But if you have large numbers of missiles coming in from multiple directions and different types of missiles which each require slightly different responses, that is when you're going to cause your enemy the maximum trouble. You could argue, in her way, Invincible is a far more defensive platform. She's about air defense with her Sea Dart missiles. She's about coordinating the aircraft for anti-submarine warfare. She's about fulfilling the flagship roles of a cruiser, but not the strike roles, not the heavy fighting roles. The Kiev still maintain that. They truly do. Then we have Ark Royal here. Ah, yes. Probably the most famous carrier name in Royal Navy history. And justifiably so, you could say. The only vessel which has been claimed to be sunk by the enemy more times than Invincible. I mean, the Germans and the Italians were claiming to sink her so often it was a running joke. It was actually a surprise when she was sunk in some ways because of the constant claims that we've sunk her, and then we've sunk her? It was a surprise to the Germans. That's the joy of World War II, though. In this scenario, though, Ark Royal was possibly one of the most useful platforms the Royal Navy had. It allowed a flexibility of approach. And that's the real thing these ships were. It was the flexibility they provided the Royal Navy. Up to including very recent events. Her ending being as interesting as her beginning, because her beginning starts off with, well, what shall we sell her to the Australians while she's under construction? Then, because the name's Ark Royal, which we'll get back to later, they decide to start offering Invincibles, and Invincible instead, and then, of course, the Falklands War happens, and they decide to not go through that, but they do go through the idea of offering to build more for the Australians should they wish to buy one. And at that time, this presents a really interesting alternate history, because the Australians did actually... there was some consideration going on. There'd been interest already in them. Falklands War had shown their capability. Maybe buy 2, maybe buy 1. Some Sea Harriers. They very quickly decide not to go with this idea, but they were considering it. Because for a short while after Falklands War, the Sea Harrier was amazing, and everyone was looking at the hype from the Falklands War and very happy with it, very interested. But Ark Royal has always had an interesting career. The name seems to attract an interesting life. She has managed to take part in the Bosnian conflict. She took part in all sorts of operations and exercises around the world. She was part of the 2003 invasion of Iraq, where she supported British forces with helicopters. Unfortunately, she lost a couple of helicopters in that operation, but she was filmed during that time for a Channel 5 documentary about her. She got adapted to being an LPH as a landing platform helicopter role, kind of like HMS Ocean, which was, interestingly enough, a commercialized design based on the Invincibles, in that, when I say commercialized, they built everything as cheap as they could, because their theory was that ship was not going to survive, was going to do a maximum of 2 trips to Norway before it was get sunk. They reckon it probably get sunk on its first trip to Norway, because the Soviets would probably hit wherever it was landing as hard as they could. She was always a subject, though, in Ark Royal's case, of controversies, because often she got a lot of money invested in her because of her name. They thought that she'd be around for a long time, because who's going to get rid of Ark Royal? It's politically going to be problematic. And they still got rid of it. The point is that Ark Royal had literally been visited by almost every Prime Minister and during her that had come about during her lifetime, during her service life, and she still got rid of. Always with the promise of jam tomorrow. That's always the way when it comes to defense cuts. There's always going to be jam tomorrow. No. We're going to rectify these capabilities. We're going to restore this ability. We're going to have this strength tomorrow. We're going to ask you to do without though now, and then we're still going to come with operations. And one of the interesting things about the carrier decision, etc., was how quickly operations came up, which made carriers very useful, and the aviation assets they provide. Libya being a good example of them, but that is the joy of history. You can always be... Well, you always have 20/20 vision in hindsight, even though you could say with that particular example that there's been enough history prior to that to show that naval aviation tends to be useful as a deployable asset. This brings us into the vital comparison, because by 2010, she is going to see Ark Royal with 4 Harriers, 7 Merlin for anti-submarine warfare facilities, and 3 Sea King airborne early warning aircraft, because they hadn't yet adapted the anti-airborne early warning system to the Merlin. Again, lessons of the Falklands War be forgotten. You know, that's the last thing we're going to do. Work out how to make the airborne early warning system work with the new airframe that we're using to replace the Sea King. No, we're just going to keep the Sea King airframes going as long as possible while we debate it. The old quote is that the rest of the world forgets history, and historians are doomed to watch the world repeat history. No, we're doomed to keep shouting at people until they remember the history and hopefully learn from it, if we're doing our job right. And this leads us kind of nicely into the vital comparison, the air groups and the weapons fit, because for the Invincibles, it's a Sea Dart missile system and 2 20mm cannon initially. They get some very nice close-in weapon systems, Vulcan and Goalkeeper, after the Falklands War, but yeah, they don't have that beforehand. That's better, that's an appeared. As you can see, the weapons fit for all the class is fairly extensive, with the Baku, and that's the otherwise known as the Admiral Gorshkov, having 6 twin P500 Basalt SSM launchers, 12 missiles, but no reload capacity. The Kiev, Minsk, and Novorossiysk all have the ability to reload their missiles. They have a magazine below deck, they have a little railway going around the front, honestly that's the best way to describe it, and they have a lift which is dedicated to it forward. Losing the dedicated lift to these large missiles and losing the magazine capacity below actually probably increased the air group capacity of the Admiral Gorshkov, the Baku, and that does seem to have played out in its transition to other roles in the world, and especially operating for the Indian forces in its adaptations, although that took a rather long time. The point you realise very quickly is that the Kievs earn their very, very many names, and they do have many names. In fact, I have a little notebook in front of me which has them in. I've already listed heavy aviation cruiser, but there's also heavy anti-submarine cruiser, or Tzoy Protivoloki cruiser, and there's also Boyshay cruiser, which is large ASW cruiser. There is also Takitsyokoi Ainosioi cruiser, which is aircraft carrying cruiser. But, you know, there are many, many different designations, and it often depends on which Soviet naval officer you're talking to, what he's going to classify them as today, in this period, because they were fitting many roles. And their air group, well, as you can see, it's roughly 30 aircraft compared to the 20 aircraft of the Invincible. One can imagine how much if they had focused completely on aircraft how many they could put on that size vessel versus the Invincible. But they don't because, well, they're cruisers. And they're also, it's a practicality of when you're jumping into these things, how good an aircraft are you going to make? And if you can focus your aircraft in on, let's say, the air defense role and the reconnaissance role, or at least the interception role and the reconnaissance role, and your helicopters on the anti-submarine warfare role, then that's a lot easier than trying to make a full working fleet carrier from the get-go. But they are capable ships, and they are festooned with weapons. They truly are festooned with weapons. In fact, as often discussed, it's basically the forward third of the ship is crammed with weapons, and the aft 2/3 is for the carry operations. But that's not quite the right way you have to consider it. And the reason I say it's not quite the right way you have to consider it is if we go back to this picture, you'll see there's weapon systems aft on the island structure. When you go back further, you can see this more clearly. This is what is meant by it being an axial offset flight deck rather than an angled flight deck. Some people make the point of going, well, it's at an angle, so obviously it's an angled flight deck. Yes, but it isn't angled for the purposes of aviation operations. It's angled for the purpose. It's an axial flight deck because it's only landing, taking off in a straight line, because you don't want to run into a weapons platform. That's it. So it's not part of an angled flight deck, which is when you have the aircraft able to launch here while they're landing here as an advantage. You can't do that. This is still an axial flight deck. But they are some really heavily armed and quite scary vessels in their time. They were really vessels which you had to pay attention to, because those big missiles, the basalt missiles, they pack a punch and a half. Saying that, the Soviets did build 4, and I think again these vessels showed the growth and development of the Soviet Navy in this time period. They show the capability growth. They show its learning from not so much revolution but evolution in technological design. One of the interesting things that, to me, with this design is they don't incorporate a ramp in this design. They incorporate the ramp is incorporated in Kuznetsov, which is a Stobar design, or Tbilisi class, as they were also called. And the point which always interested me with the Kievs was, why not put a ski jump in there? That could have helped the Forger achieve far better operational capabilities. In the end, I think because they preferred pushing on and developing the next generation of carrier and getting as much information as they could out of these, and they could do the role they required of them. They could do what they were requiring them. Once you start fitting ski ramps and these things, you are really emphasizing the aviation role, and these ships are far more balanced in terms of being both aviation ships and cruisers. Because that's what they needed them for. And here is the Baku, or the Admiral Gorshkov. Now, she gets renamed, of course, because after the fall of the Soviet Union, Azerbaijan goes independent, and Baku is now in Azerbaijan, no longer part of the Soviet Union. And Russia decides they really want to honor Sergei Gorshkov, who was, of course, responsible for the expansion of their navy during the Cold War. So, there you go. Rename of Baku to the Admiral Gorshkov. But what you will notice is, looking at this picture of this vessel, is it looks mean. It is impressive, but that is a scary looking ship. It's got guns on there, which is usually scary enough, but there are also missiles which are visibly the size of the aircraft on the flight deck behind them. Yes, it's able to launch 12. It's not able to rearm them. doesn't have a magazine space, and apparently didn't have the railway and the special elevator for their missiles. So it could only fire 12. It couldn't fire 8 and then fire another 8. But that doesn't really matter, because that is still 12 missiles, 12 massive missiles heading for you. And that's going to be part of an overall strike package, which is going to include aircraft from land launching missiles, backfire bombers, and submarines, and other ships, all launching together. That's their aim. Overwhelming combined arms is how you phrase it, and it's how you treat it as well. Now, her service with the Soviet Union was also about developing and testing technologies which would go in the Tbilisi or Kuznetsov class carriers and the things which would come after, which put her in a good position for when, after the Cold War was over and after Russia could no longer continue to operate her, they agreed to sell her to India. Now, India wants her to be the Vikramaditya, which I probably just mangled horribly, but it's a key part of their carrier battle forces, which, along with the Vikrant, which replaced the older Vikrant, the Vikramaditya replaced the Virat. They basically replaced 2 older British-built light fleet carriers with a Soviet Union Russian modified carrier to what the Indian Navy wanted, which is far more of a carrier than a carrier cruiser, and an indigenous built ship to form the core of their carrier battle groups and their fleet operations. And to be fair, this really shows how much of this design could be got out of it, how much could be got out of this design when you look at what's got out of her in her Indian form. Because in her Soviet form, she's carrying 12 Yak-38s and 20 helicopters, so 32 aircraft of quite small types. In her Vikramaditya form, not Vikrant, Vikramaditya form, she's carrying 26 MiG-29s and 10 Kamov Ka-31 or Ka-28s. Slightly bigger helicopters, a lot bigger aircraft. She's gone up to 36. It makes sense when you're serving the Soviet Union in their Bastion defense and part of their combined operations to build this ship. It doesn't make sense for the Indian Navy when you're trying to control the Indian Ocean. And that brings us to the summary of this discussion, and frankly, I decided to go for HMS Illustrious and Bulwark near Haustad, Norway during the cold response of 2012 because I like the picture. Honestly, I needed a summary photo, and I just liked that one, so that's the one I went with. Interesting enough, both these designs to me are responses to the idea of we still need naval aviation, even organic naval aviation with our task groups, even in scenarios where we're going to have lots of land support. Where we're supposed to have lots of land support, where we're supposed to have lots of support from the... And that's a feature of modern warfare. That is a feature of modern warfare. Now, these days you might say, well, maybe we can get away with the reconnaissance capability being drones. You can. But what about the interception capability? And is it really enough? I would also argue these ships are a product of their times, because during the Cold War there are large amounts of land-based aviation. There are large amounts of aircraft, large amounts of capability going around. So that means you can make the case, well, we can also do this. Whilst providing a constant combat air patrol over northern Scotland and the North Sea to prevent against attacks which might filter past Scandinavia to get to the UK, and also supporting operations in Scandinavia and supporting operations in Germany. We can also provide aircraft over the Royal Navy as they're moving. You can make that case. And with the Soviet Union, we are going to be operating in the bastions. We've got all this land-based naval aviation. We will, of course, be able to support our task groups. We'll, of course, be able to integrate with them, protect them, because they're going to be operating in these areas. When we've got all this aviation, you can make that case. As difficult as I find it to make that case, because there's always that gap of time between you going out and coming back from that fleet to where you need to rearm and refuel and carry on. Now, you can say, well, we've got tanker support. Oh, great. So where's the tankers coming from? They're coming from home. Okay. That's a point of failure and a point of danger, but okay, fine, you've got tanker support. Where are the aircraft going to rearm? They still have to go back. And any ongoing engagement, any engagement which is multiple waves, that rearmament might mean you no longer have fighters. And if you want examples of that, I can point you to World War II. I can point you to the battles in the Mediterranean, where aircraft from Malta were trying to assist convoys, trying to assist carriers when they were a carrier when it was damaged, trying to get to them. And even the carrier's own aircraft, which had been forced to land and operate from Malta because of that, couldn't do enough. Because as long as they could operate, great. But the moment they ran out of ammunition, they had to go home. They had to go back to that airstrip, away from the carrier. And that takes time and means they're off station. And also adds tiredness. It adds length of flight onto the pilots. It wears them down more. It also means they're not in the same position for intercepting. Whereas if the enemy strike is coming towards you here and you're coming from here, it's an easy intercept. If the target is here, the enemy are here, and you're coming from over there, that's a more difficult intercept. Aircraft, though in limited numbers, can be useful for limited strikes. They can be used for all sorts of operations. And as you can point to the Falklands War, you can go, one of those carriers only had 8 aircraft on it, and 8 of the Sea Harriers, and 12 Sea Kings, so, you know, that worked. The other one had 20. And that's the point. You need a certain mass. You need a certain volume of capability. Small carriers, cruiser carriers, through-deck cruisers, all these things, they have a role. They do have a role. They are useful. But that's limited. It's always limited. It's historically always been limited. These ships show the value of that role. They show how useful they can be for nations to project themselves. But they also show the limitations of them. And that, I suppose, is the balancing legacy of them. So, I always finish videos with a question, and this is without a doubt always going to be part of it. So I've got 2 questions. One, the British get really inspired by the Kievs, and they go for a larger, more Kievish Invincible design. What do you think it looks like? What do you think it's armed with? What do you think its air group is? I'd say if they go for a slightly larger version, they're going to carry more aircraft as well, but we'll let that slide. And the other point, and this is the other question I want you to consider, what happens if the Australians do buy 2? If the Australians, not of the original 3, but they take up the British government's offer and they go, we'd like 2. We'd like to buy 2. And they buy their own 2. What names are they called? Still Sydney and Canberra? I think there's a good chance of that. But how does it go? How does the Australians operating a Sea Harrier force and their own little carriers, how does that affect things in the world? What do you think they get involved in? What operations do you think they carry out? How does it affect Australian defence spending, but also defence perception in that period? Because I'd say Sydney and Canberra have been pretty much quite a big success in terms of disaster relief and recovering people from natural disasters, which has earned them a lot of kudos. But I'd like to hear your opinion. And so onwards the pneumonia recovery schedule. What have we got this week? We've got on Thursday, it's going to be the Angelina's drone carrying fleet carrier video. And it's going to be on Saturday, the Conception Operation Conclusion on Nimitz class. And all of them like this are going to be premieres, so that people will definitely see them. And then Next week, well, that's going to be War is Over. War has just begun, the current carrier generation. And then David T's alternate history, naval heritage question, which was, which three scrap ships from any time and place would you wish to have seen preserved? I'm going to do a top 10 for that. So I can explain why the three are in my final three. Also, I will now point out that I'm far enough from Drakenfell that I can maybe say I would have preserved something other than Warspite, so Warspite is not necessarily in the final three. But she might still be in the final three, she just might not be. But that depends on whether I am far enough away from Drakenfell that I will not have a very angry vehicle turn up and pulling into my drive a couple of hours after the video's gone out. We'll see what happens. And yeah, at the moment, as I've already discussed, but I'm going to discuss again, all the fundraising, all the money coming into this channel is going on bookshelves. Because I've moved and because of pneumonia, I can't build the bookshelves. So I am having to buy calyxes, which are probably going to see me for the next 2 to 3, 4, 5 years, honestly. When I start being honest, thinking about it and looking at the projects I've got on this one. I think when I'm fitter and healthier, I think the first project I'm probably going to tackle is the dormer windows in the roof. I might even get help for that, and then eventually sorting out the garage and a few other things, because we haven't got a garage at the moment. It needs to be built on here. And there are going to be a list of other projects. The joy of home ownership. The thing which you would have dealt with first, quickly, once you moved in, and when you're sort of have all the professionals around, so therefore me going and mucking around, when the British gas people are sorting out, would have been stupid. Let the British gas people sort out the radiators and the other things while I put in shelves. That's fine. But once they're gone and there's still the big projects remaining, then probably it'll be me stripping and sanding and repairing and rebuilding the deck and things like that. Or potentially I'll manage to pass it off onto the handyman who's been working for us to cover for me. Tempting. Very tempting. He's very good at his job, and whilst it does cost money, does mean I could concentrate on bookshelves. I haven't even managed to hang pictures though yet. That's how bad I am. Disorganised, let's say, or work focused. Thank you very much everyone for your support. I said everything's going for bookshelves at the moment to support the books. Normally it's going for books, but that's going for the bookshelves to support the books. And it really does mean a lot, honestly. Thank you, and take care. And hopefully you should see the new bookshelves at the end of by the end of the week for the Brew Ships Live. Hopefully they'll have arrived and I'll have assembled by that time, and all the books will be out. Well, at least half the books will be out, because I'm ordering half the bookshelves in one go and then half the bookshelves next time to spread the cost. So what have we got coming up? Conception, operation, conclusion of the Kuznetsov class, Soviet naval aviation, a little bit of a history of that coming up. Conception, operation, conclusion of the Charles de Gaulle and French and other nations, World War II carrier naval aviation. That's going to be October's fun. And then we've got November, the never built carriers. The two historians, the Royal Navy that could have been, with a special guest, Drakenfell, me and him having a chat about all sorts of things, honestly. We've been talking about what that could be talking about, and honestly, it's going to probably just end up being... It will end up being a premiere, because, frankly, I think you're going to want to know it's happening, and B, it's going to be a fun, long chat. It is going to be a fun, long chat. And conception, operation, conclusion of the Queen Elizabeth class. A little bit early, but, conclusion on so far, I should say. And 881 Squadron. 820 Squadron and etc., which have been sort of lost at the moment because of the particularities of dealing with pneumonia is going to turn up again in December. So don't worry, none of the videos which were listed here, which I will make sure all will have been done by the end of the year, because this is the year of aircraft carriers, and this is what the videos are about. Thank you very much again for your support. Thank you very much for all your help. Thank you very much for all your care and kindness, and I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope you found it interesting. Take care, and see you later in the week.